Alright, so I thought I'd make a quick kind of mini review video for Rome Remastered because right now it's still got mixed reviews on Steam, and I can tell a lot of people are probably wondering whether it's actually a good product or not. And whether you are or not, or whether you just want to hear my thoughts, I thought I'd share those just in case it's helpful. Obviously, mixed reviews on Steam is not actually very helpful for consumers because it doesn't tell you, for example, if everyone thinks it's roughly a 5 out of 10 game, or if half the people think it's more like 1 out of 10 and the other half think it's 10 out of 10. Obviously, in practice, it means that roughly the same number of people are giving it positive reviews as negative reviews, but all in all, it's not very telling as a metric, so I'm going to give my thoughts on the remaster. Normally I would use a script for a video like this, but I want this to be pretty informal and off the cuff, so I'm just going to go through a number of points and just give my thoughts. So I need to be clear at the start here that I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who played the original Rome, somebody who hasn't really played the newer Total War titles, and somebody who continued to play the original Rome all the way up to very recently, to the point where I was still uploading playthroughs of the original Rome Total War, as recently as a few months before the remaster came out. I'm going to talk about the things that I think are very good, the things that I think are less good or bad, and at the end I'm going to summarize my thoughts, and if you are thinking of buying it, then I will try and reach some kind of conclusion about that. Also, for full disclosure, Creative Assembly did give me this copy of the game. It's not affected my opinion in any way, but just be aware of that. If you're the kind of person who believes that's going to unconsciously bias me, that's fine, obviously take that into account as you listen to my opinions. I personally think I'm going to be pretty balanced here, and I'm going to try and reach the same conclusion I would have reached if I had to buy the game at full price. A lot of reviews I've seen for this are people who played the game for maybe 2 or 3 hours, and I personally have played for a total of 25 to 30 hours so far, and I feel like my views are pretty well developed at this point. So let's start off with the graphics, and I'm not going to dwell on this too long because I think this is the number one thing where you can probably make your own judgment just by looking at people's videos, for example. Although I should caveat that with the fact that I'm mostly using low or medium settings, so you're not going to see the game in its best possible light if you're just purely using my video to inform your view. Also, YouTube video compression does suck, so whatever you're seeing on your screen right now is probably going to be a step down on whatever I'm seeing in my own files. Again, I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who played the original Rome. I'm not comparing it to newer Total War titles, which you can probably make your own judgment on if you've played those. And I have to say, I do notice a really massive step up. Even on the very lowest settings, there's a really big improvement to how the game looks visually. It is pretty much just the original game with a new coat of paint. That's pretty much exactly what people wanted. We already tried Rome 2, we already did a completely new thing with that. Rome Remastered is just the original Rome, but brought up to modern standards, or something resembling modern standards. So going off my very recent experience of the original Rome and comparing it to Remastered, there's a really obvious step up. It looks a lot better in a lot of ways. There are all kinds of new things they've added, like for example the differentiation between different individuals in the same unit, which make the visuals of the game feel a lot more flavourful, and they have done some functional things with it as well, like for example, in the original Rome, if you had a fight in a proper forested map, you often just couldn't see what was going on. There was nothing you could do to actually see what was going on. This is like the worst battle map of all time. There's literally nowhere we can deploy from what I can see that doesn't involve just being completely obscured by gigantic trees. The best you could do is scroll your mouse wheel as much as possible, bring it all the way down to the forest floor and just attempt to peer through the trees. It was really horrible, it was not a good experience, and the ability to actually look through the trees more now is definitely a welcome change. Again, I'm not someone who has really high standards when it comes to graphics. I grew this YouTube channel primarily off the back of Age of Empires 2 and Heroes of Might and Magic 3 videos. Those are both games that originally came out over 20 years ago, so my standards are not high. The only thing I would say is that there were a couple of choices made in terms of the kind of palette of the game that I think are really questionable. For example, I'm really not a fan of this kind of bright green neon grass that we see in Italy. I think it looks really horrible. We see it in some other places on the map as well. I just don't understand what they were thinking with that. It's kind of this puke green color. I think it looks really horrible, but I have turned my campaign map saturation down to the lowest possible setting in graphics settings, and at that point I think it looks pretty much fine. If you don't like the kind of bright fluorescent armors that you see on different types of units, you can also switch that off as well, so the game gives you lots of options if you have certain preferences in terms of style. I would also point out that even on some of the lowest graphics settings, there are some things that look really nice here, like for example, the water along the shoreline looks really crisp and clear, and the torches in night battles, even though they're a fairly simple model, do give off a nice ambient glow that adds a lot of atmosphere. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on graphics, you probably already have your own opinion. Let's just move on to performance. So I think something that's been kind of forgotten and overlooked when it comes to performance is that the original Rome was not running well for the vast majority of people. In fact, it was pretty terrible for most people. The Steam forums are literally full of people talking about severe campaign map lag, for example. there were all kinds of weird little problems that people had. The campaign map lag, for example, you had to download an external file called d3d9.dll, and you had to put it in your installation folder. For a lot of people, that was literally the only way to solve the FPS drops. And moving away from the campaign map, I have to say I also personally experienced really severe FPS drops whenever I tried to use flaming ammo. I'm not sure why, but every time, whether it was an archer or an onager, anytime I tried to use flaming ammo, it would just immediately drop to almost single figures in FPS. So I literally just completely avoided using those features in the original ROM. Another feature I just didn't use was triple battle speed. So I could use double battle speed, it just about could manage that, but whenever I tried to take it up to triple speed in a battle, the FPS drop would just be absolutely terrible. And it was to the point where double speed was actually running faster than triple speed just because my PC could actually handle it. And my PC is bad, it's 8 years old I think, it's from 2013. But in theory, it should be more than good enough for a game like Rome Total War that came out about 10 years before that. So naturally, I came into the remaster thinking it's going to be a higher demand version of the original game, and I was expecting to see some serious performance issues, but I actually found that it runs better than the original game, and in some cases it's a really significant difference. I'm not sure exactly what they've done to optimize it, it might be something to do with the number of cores used by the processor, but there's a really noticeable improvement for me in terms of FPS. There's no random drop in frames when somebody tries to use flaming ammo, there's no significant lag when I try to use triple speed or double speed, it all just runs a lot smoother. I do have a bottleneck, which is my graphics card. My graphics card is an NVIDIA GeForce 765M, which is probably not familiar at all to the vast majority of people watching this video. It's very much not standing up to modern standards, but the game does run on kind of low, medium graphics settings completely fine, and I have to say, even with the fixes that I tried using for the original ROM, Remastered does play nicer, it does feel nicer, it feels smoother, it runs smoother. Even things like end turns are faster. I know people say that the end turns on Rome Total War are just really fast in general, but even things like that, I can notice it's even faster on Rome Remastered than it was in the original Rome. I have to say that I have seen some people mention that they've experienced crashes on Remastered. Personally, I've not experienced any crashes at all, but obviously if you have bought it, you should try playing it as soon as possible just to check that your PC can run it okay, because if it can't, you can then just refund it. The next big positive I want to mention is the modding potential. The original Rome had a hard-coded limit of I think 21 factions, and that really held back certain overhaul mods like for example Europa Barbarorum, which was an attempt to create an extremely historically accurate mod set in that kind of Rome Total War time period. The devs for Remastered have said they're going to try to lift the faction cap to I think 31 factions initially, so that's going to really increase the potential for different types of mods, and in particular mods with really huge sprawling maps with many different types of factions on them. And that's all in addition to the various optimizations that have been made, which should mean that mods are now able to run a bit smoother, and obviously there is a lot of potential for improved graphics as well. I do want to caveat this a bit because I think there are a couple of factors here that have been kind of overlooked. The first one is we can expect the barriers to entry for modders are going to be higher now because you're going to need a higher level of technical skill to create graphics that fit the new standards, and it's probably going to be more time consuming for modders as well. I think given the time and the skill that's going to be needed for that, we can't necessarily set our expectations too high. There might not be as many mods as we would necessarily like coming out for this, and when they do come out they might be slightly longer in development than some of us expect. The second caveat is that we can be pretty confident that Rome Remastered is not going to take the world by storm, and the vast majority of people who are going to mod it are going to be the same people who were already modding the original Rome. And also some of those modders are probably just going to experience burnout because they've been working on certain projects for years for the original Rome, and they've now found that there's a new version of Rome coming out, which in some ways is going to require them to go all the way back to the drawing board and start doing all kinds of things from scratch. A lot of modders are just going to feel too burnt out by that, and there's not going to be too much new blood because the vast majority of people buying Rome Remastered are the same people who were already playing the original Rome. We've already seen some evidence that might be happening as well, like for example Gallu, the former head mod author for the Divide and Conquer mod for Medieval 2, which is based on Third Age Total War, and maybe one of the best mods of all time, recently announced that he was stepping back from the modding team for that mod, pretty much as a direct result of Rome Remastered being announced, or at least that's what pushed him over the edge. And it's completely understandable because nobody knew Rome Remastered was coming, and there are going to be question marks around the longevity of certain mods. For example, if you were going to go and create a massive mod project based on Rome Remastered, you could reasonably be pretty cautious and pretty careful because there's a good chance that Medieval 2 Remastered is going to come out at some point, and when it does, in some ways it might make Rome Remastered kind of outdated as a modding platform, so there might be some hesitance in general on the part of mod authors to work on this. Still, with those two caveats out the way, I think there is a lot of potential here. I think we could have some really fantastic mods coming out over the next few years, and I really do hope that we do get several years of good mods coming out for this, because the potential is absolutely huge. There's so much that could be done. There are so many issues with vanilla and the way it plays out, and its predictability and its level of challenge that can really be improved upon by modders. So I really hope we see a lot of really good things coming up in the next few years. But if you share my doubts about that, you can of course just wait and see what mods come out, and decide to buy the game on that basis. It's pretty clear that Rome Remastered is always going to be available for purchase, so as long as you keep it on your radar, if modding is one of your key benefits to buying this, you can always just bide your time and see what projects are being worked on. So those are the main positives I want to mention, and I'm going to move on now to talk about some of the things that I felt were either negative or just missed opportunities with the Remastered. Firstly, a major issue with the original Rome and how dated it's become is the pathfinding in settlements. And as far as I can tell, it's really not been improved in any significant way. And in fact, it almost feels worse now because there is now a visualization of the exact path that your units are trying to follow. So whereas before things just felt chaotic and you couldn't really understand why, now you can actually see the completely nonsensical paths that your units are trying to walk in. And it does feel really stupid and really counterintuitive. You can see units just following completely nonsensical paths. You can see them going really long ways out of the town square, for example, and situations like that. It's almost like they see these invisible walls and they just kind of meander around them, and sometimes your units are going to end up getting caught in situations that should never have happened. You can see open spaces which are just not treated as open spaces, and it does detract from the enjoyment of siege battles. I personally avoid siege battles. In the original Rome, I honestly actively try to skip them a lot of the time because I just find open battlefields are so much better for pathfinding. With that said, as I've already alluded to, it's no worse than it was in the original game, so if you play the original game and you're worried about buying this because of pathfinding, it's going to be exactly the same as what you're already used to. My assumption was that this was really difficult for the devs to solve. There must be some really deep underlying reasons why these nonsensical paths happen, and my assumption is it was probably just too much of a big task for them to do it on the budget they were given. Obviously though, that principle does cut both ways, so if it was a case of the game being given not a big enough budget for that, then it follows that they can't really expect consumers to pay a high price for the game either. One thing to mention about pathfinding is the devs do officially recommend that you stick to high unit scale and below. They don't recommend going for ultra unit scale, which is what I typically use in my videos. However, I have had some comments from people who do use the lower unit scales, and they've said there are still some pathfinding issues, so lowering the unit scale is really just a band-aid solution. It doesn't properly solve the problem. I was going to talk about the UI next, but that's going to require some finesse, so let's just leave it be for now and let's talk about rebalancing. So the campaign rebalancing I think is really good. Most of it does make sense. The only caveat to that is I think the way they've rebalanced the campaign actually makes the game easier overall. So for example, Squalor is much more reasonable now. It's capped at a much lower level. I think previously it just wasn't capped at all. So that means that public order issues are much less likely to affect you when you play the campaign. The problem with that is that most people who still play the original Rome understand the game well enough that even playing on its highest difficulties is not necessarily that difficult. So to take away some of the stuff that, yeah, it didn't make sense, like Squalor was ridiculous, it was unbalanced, but managing it created a sense of challenge. Not a great sense of challenge, not a very rewarding sense of challenge, but it was a sense of challenge that's no longer there. I kind of feel like a bit of a missed opportunity here is just the difficulty settings. We're still limited to very hard, and we were given a number of features that actually make it a lot more beginner friendly. That's good for beginners, but a lot of people buying this, and in fact I think most people buying this, aren't actually beginners, so it would have been good to just have a bit of extra challenge, I think. The way the original difficulty settings work was not very enjoyable from a player perspective. It essentially just made units overpowered. Enemy units became overpowered, they had massive bonuses to their attack and defense. But if they could have come up with a more innovative way to make the game more challenging, I think that would have been welcomed by most experienced players. When it comes to unit rebalancing, I feel a lot more mixed, and I feel like a lot of the changes here were just kind of unnecessary. They've actually done quite a lot of tinkering with factions like Egypt and Pontus, and both of those factions were already fine in the original game. Most of the changes they've made are really minor, very small adjustments to units' morale stats, very small adjustments to units' costs. But what I don't really understand is why that was focused on factions like Egypt and Pontus, which were already completely fine, and not on factions like Dacia, Thrace, Numidia and Spain, which are probably the four just least interesting factions in the game. And those 4 factions are still the least interesting factions in the game. They just don't have a good unit roster. They don't have any good elite units. You could argue that Spain has the Bull Warriors and Thrace has the Bastane, but those are the only things that make those factions feel unique. Outside of those 2 units, both of those factions feel extremely generic, extremely uninteresting. I feel like there was an opportunity there to make them more interesting, especially in multiplayer, because in the single player campaign, it does kind of make sense to leave them as they are. Like Numidia, for example, that was a good challenge. You have to rely on a lot of skirmisher-based units. But in multiplayer, things just feel completely overlooked. There's no reason to play as these factions. There never was in the original Rome. There was an opportunity to add a bit of variety, make some other factions more interesting, but instead a lot of time has been spent on factions like Pontus, Egypt, Armenia, which was not as good perhaps as some of the other factions, but was near enough. And there's also been some changes made to Carthage and to the Seleucid Empire. And one of the main things they've done is they've nerfed chariots. So they've taken chariots, pretty much every chariot in the game, and they've dropped their morale stats. So for example, for Britannia, their chariots are now worse, but their other units are all pretty much exactly the same as they already were. Britannia was never an overpowered faction except on the campaign map, and it was overpowered on the campaign map because of auto-resolve. Auto-resolve was really biased in favour of chariots. But they supposedly fixed auto-resolve anyway, so if they have fixed auto-resolve, if the chariots' morale wasn't the reason they were overpowered, then there's no real reason to nerf the chariots beyond that. I know I'm kind of sticking my head above the parapet here because some people do think the chariots in the original Rome are really overpowered, but I personally don't. They have huge hitboxes, they have almost no defense. All you need to do is just shoot them with any kind of archer, and they actually go down really easy. They're hard counters for cavalry, they're really good at routing infantry units that are already close to breaking, but they're really hard countered as well by archers. And they also can't deal too well with densely packed infantry because the only thing you need to do to kill a chariot is just hit it with as many things as possible, as quickly as possible. But yeah, they've nerfed chariots, they've enhanced skirmishers, which I think is a very good change because nobody used those. But there's been almost nothing done for factions like Dacia, Thrace, and so on. These factions are not played very often, and I think a big part of the reason for that is they have these really limited unit rosters. I'm not saying they should have added new units to the game, but perhaps they could have taken some of the old units that these factions rely on and just made them more interesting as choices. I think it would have been really interesting if, for example, a unit like Volksman was given the armor-piercing ability, or if the recruitment cost of something like Bull Warriors was reduced, since they do perform worse than urban cohorts despite costing more. And unlike the Romans, Spain really doesn't have anything else of note. I really can't work out why they've taken a unit like Desert Axemen, which are actually, in my opinion, pretty terrible units, because unlike Desert Cavalry they don't have an armor-piercing weapon, and they've made them cost more, but they haven't taken a unit like the Bull Warriors, which is very reasonably priced when it comes to upkeep, but is overpriced when it comes to recruitment, and actually made it a little bit cheaper. All in all, it just felt like the priorities were in slightly the wrong place there, and I think they could have focused it slightly different. But with that said, they've only really tinkered around the edges, they haven't changed things too much. Most players probably wouldn't notice any difference to chariots, and that's one of the bigger changes. So they've taken a conservative approach, and I think for the most part it does work, it's not a problem. I just think there was an opportunity there to change things up a bit more, especially when it comes to multiplayer. Because people are still playing multiplayer, people carried on playing multiplayer for the original Rome, all the way up to the present day. And you've got YouTube channels like Prince of Macedon who's been uploading multiplayer content for the original Rome for literally over a decade as far as I'm aware, so I feel like there's a community there that could have been served better. In single player, it's fair enough, having factions with a very limited roster does create a lot of challenge, but there just aren't many interesting options available to some of these factions. So now we come to the UI, and the UI is definitely the most controversial part of the remaster, and I very much share the opinion that it's definitely a step down on the original. I think the worst thing about this is that certain things you want to do now just require more clicks than they did before. So for example, notifications used to just fall down in a neat line along the side of your screen, but now for some reason they're tucked away in 3 different tabs. You have to open the tabs up, and I know it's literally a split second, but you're doing it multiple times per turn, and there's just this sense that it's completely unnecessary, it doesn't add anything to the game. And it's all really small as well. I personally have turned the UI up to its highest possible setting, which is 120%. And that I think is what should have been the default setting. A lot of people have said that the UI in its default form is just too small, and I think it is. Stuff on the original Rome used to just appear in the middle of the screen, and it was easy to read, you didn't have to squint. It was just a better system in general. I did have a silver lining. I had a positive thing that I wanted to mention, which is that when you open up the town screen, you can see a list of your settlements, and you can see which ones are currently building, and which ones are currently recruiting units, and you can actually click through these one by one and start building new buildings without having to actually scroll through each individual town. The problem is, as soon as you try to recruit a unit instead, it completely switches the town screen over to a list of your different agents, and it's just completely irrelevant. It completely ruins the flow of it. Whatever efficiency you were getting out of the town screen is just lost the moment you try to recruit some units. I don't know why they've done it that way, but that was the silver lining I wanted to mention, and I've changed my mind about it. I think it's bad. I think it could have been done better. I think the UI in general is just a bit too clunky. Everything takes a little bit too long. Even simple things like changing tax rates now require an extra click compared to before. It all just feels a lot slower and less efficient, and I don't know why they've made a lot of these changes. Another thing I dislike is they've taken a lot of the hotkeys you rely on in the original Rome, and they've made them more long-winded to use. So for example, if you want to rally your troops with your general, or if you want to switch a phalanx in and out of phalanx formation, you used to just be able to press the F key and that was it. But now you have to hold down the Alt key and press one of the numerical buttons, I can't remember which, but it's just an extra step that doesn't need to be there. And the worst part is, I don't know why, but you're not able to change this in the control settings right now. I have no idea why they changed it. It's now 2 keys to do something that you used to just be able to do with 1 button press. You're doing this kind of thing several times in every single battle. I just can't understand why they've chosen to make it more long-winded than it was in the original. However, with all of that off my chest, the UI is not as bad as some people are making it out to be. You do get used to it, you do grumble at 1 or 2 of the inefficiencies that weren't there before, but it's still the same game. You do get used to the changes. It's not such a big deal. I'm honestly surprised that a lot of people are claiming they got it refunded purely based on the UI. And I do notice that a lot of the people who are commenting and reviewing with things like this are literally people who only tried playing it for 1 or 2 hours. If you're really deeply offended by the UI changes and it really just completely puts you off, then fair enough, you probably shouldn't buy Rome Remastered. But at the same time, I think for the vast majority of people, give it a few hours, see if you can get used to it. It's probably not going to be as painful to adapt to as you think it is. The final thing I want to mention is I just think some of the marketing around Rome Remastered is a little bit disingenuous. I'm thinking specifically of the claim that there are 16 additional playable factions. The majority of people who played the original Rome will know that all you had to do was open up a text file and move a few of the factions' names from one row to another, and that did unlock most of those factions which are supposedly newly playable. There are 3 factions which genuinely you couldn't play as before, which you can now play as, which are the Romano-British, the Ostrogoths and the Slavs. All of those are in the Barbarian Invasion expansion, and they were previously only available as Horde factions. You couldn't play as them, they weren't on the map at the start of the campaign, but they have now been added as genuine playable factions. Obviously the decision was made to not differentiate between those 3 factions and the other 13 factions that have been added, or supposedly added, but I think for most people who did play the original, the idea that there are 16 new factions to play as isn't really reflective of the reality. My next negative is fairly minor, but just to mention that Rome Remastered only works on Windows 10. So if you have a previous version of Windows, it's not going to work. That hasn't affected me personally, but I know a few people have been let down, so just bear that in mind. The other thing I dislike is the decision to take the original Rome off sale on Steam. I think there are genuine advantages to playing the original Rome, which some people do care about, and people should have that choice without having to buy Remastered. I also think it's a bit of a shame that there doesn't seem to be any indication we're going to see a multiplayer campaign for this game, since a lot of people would have definitely enjoyed playing with their friends, either competitively or in co-op. So now we come to the final question, which is it worth buying if you haven't already bought it? I was originally going to come out with a really annoying fence-sitting answer along the lines of, it's up to you, you know how much this money is worth to you, only you really know if a new version of Rome Total War with a new coat of paint is genuinely worthwhile for you or not. And to be fair, that is your choice to make. However, I would also say that the default price for this, which is £25 in the UK, or I think $30 in the US, seems a bit steep for a game that in some ways is still stuck in the past in terms of its mechanics. There is currently a half-price offer for people who have the original Rome Total War, and I have to say at that kind of price, if it's on sale, I personally would probably go for it, because I think it is a better experience than the original game. At this point, I genuinely would not go back to the original Rome unless I was playing a mod. Rome Remastered to me just does feel better. It's better graphically, it's better in terms of performance. Most of the best mods of the future are going to come out for Remastered instead of the original, and I think depending on what we get in terms of mods, that alone could make it worth the price. If you really want to go back as soon as possible and re-experience the original Rome, or if you never played it in the first place and you want to see what it's like as soon as possible, then you might want to buy Remastered sooner rather than later. But for the majority of people, and for me personally, if I was going to buy this, I would probably wait until it's on sale. So yeah, no script, I've probably forgotten at least one thing I wanted to mention, but those are my thoughts on Rome Remastered. I hope it's been helpful. Thanks for watching, do subscribe for more content if you're interested, or check out one of my campaign playthroughs, and I'll see you next time.